Okay, so sorry. All right, so good evening, everyone. Today's presentation is going to be about CTE. Um, when you hear about CTE, it's usually because another former athlete has been diagnosed after their death. We hear the name, people talk about concussions for a few days, and then the story disappears. But the reality is that CTE doesn't suddenly appear when someone reaches the NFL or another professional league. It's something that develops over years of repeated head impacts, many of which begin in youth sports. Today, I want to talk about what CTE actually is, why it matters, and what I think we should be doing differently. Specifically, I'll explain how repeated head impacts can affect the brain, why young athletes are especially vulnerable, and why I believe schools and youth sports organizations should require mandatory concussion education and preseason baseline cognitive testing. First, what is CTE? According to the National Institutes of Health, it is a progressive brain disease associated with repeated head impacts over time. CTE cannot currently be diagnosed while someone is alive. Doctors can only confirm it after death by examining brain tissue. One of the biggest misconceptions is that CTE only appears after multiple diagnosed concussions. That's not necessarily true. Researchers have found that repeated hits to the head, even those that don't cause noticeable concussion symptoms, can still contribute to long-term brain damage. Over time, abnormal proteins called tau build up in the brain, interfering with normal brain function. Symptoms can include memory loss, confusion, mood swings, depression, aggression, and eventually dementia. So let's move on to slide 2. Wait. Okay. Who's at risk? Many people automatically think of football when they hear about CTE. And for good reason, football involves repeated collisions on nearly every play. But football isn't the only sport where athletes are at risk. Boxers experience repeated punches to the head over the course of their careers. MMA fighters in the UFC absorb both strikes and knockouts. Hockey players experience collisions with other players on the boards. Rugby players are involved in constant physical contact. Even soccer players who may never experience a major concussion repeatedly head the ball throughout games and practices, and researchers continue to study how those repetitive impacts affect the brain over time. In other words, this isn't a football problem, it's a contact sports problem. So, one of the reasons this issue is so concerning is because it often starts at a very young age. Children and teenagers have developing brains that are more vulnerable to injury than adults. According to the CDC, young athletes frequently fail to report concussion symptoms because they don't want to leave the game, disappoint their teammates, or lose playing time. Think about that for a second. A 14 or 15-year-old isn't thinking about what their brain might look like 30 years from now. They're thinking about Friday Night Lights game. They're thinking about earning a starting position. They're thinking about helping their team win. Because of that, many athletes continue playing even after experiencing symptoms like dizziness, headaches, blurred vision, or confusion. The CDC also found that youth tackle football players experience significantly more head impacts than athletes playing flag football, showing just how much repetitive contact can accumulate throughout a season. The real life impact. Okay, so unfortunately, we've already seen what the long-term effects can look like. Junior Seau was one of the greatest linebackers in NFL history. After he died by suicide in 2012, researchers found that he had CTE. Aaron Hernandez, a former NFL player, was diagnosed with severe stage 3 CTE after his death at only 27 years old. Former NFL player Philip Adams was also diagnosed with severe CTE after his death. Demarius Thomas, another former NFL player, was found to have stage 2 CTE. Researchers cannot say that CTE directly caused these individuals' actions or deaths. However, according to the Boston University CTE Center, CTE has been associated with symptoms including depression, impaired judgment, and impulsivity and cognitive decline. These stories remind us that brain injuries can affect much more than athletic performance. They can affect relationships, careers, mental health, and entire lives. Let's move on to the next slide. The solution. I'm so sorry. I think I'm echoing a little bit. Mom, could you turn down your volume just a tiny bit? All right. The solution. Now, sports themselves are not the problem. Sports teach discipline, teamwork, leadership, and perseverance. I would never argue that children should stop playing sports. Instead, I believe we need to do a better job protecting them while they play. That's why I believe every youth and high school sports organization should require mandatory concussion education, and preseason baseline cognitive testing. Concussion education should be required for athletes, parents, and coaches before every season begins. Everyone should know how to recognize concussion symptoms, understand why reporting those symptoms is important, and learn the dangers of returning to play too soon. Education changes behavior. A recent peer-reviewed study evaluating the CDC's Heads Up Concussion Education program found that coaches who completed the training improved their concussion knowledge and were more likely to discuss concussion safety with their athletes. Knowledge alone won't eliminate injuries, but it helps create a culture where athletes feel comfortable speaking up instead of hiding symptoms. The second part is cognitive testing. Before the season begins, athletes complete a series of tests measuring memory, reaction time, balance, and cognitive function. If they later suffer a suspected concussion, doctors have something to compare those results against instead of guessing when an athlete is ready to return. Medical professionals can make more informed decisions based on objective information. This helps reduce the risk of athletes returning too soon, too early, and suffering another brain injury. Some people argue these programs cost too much or take too much time, but compared to the lifelong cost of brain injuries, including medical treatment, rehabilitation, and lost quality of life, the cost of education and baseline testing is pretty small. Others argue that many schools already have concussion protocols. While that's true, policies still vary widely depending on the school, district, sports, organization. Every young athlete deserves the same level of protection regardless of where they play. So we have the choice. Now, I'd like you to imagine two different futures. In the first, every young athlete begins the season with concussion education. Coaches know the warning signs, parents know what symptoms to watch for, athletes report injuries honestly because they understand what's at stake. Doctors use baseline testing to make safer return to play decisions. Now imagine the opposite. Athletes continue hiding symptoms because they don't want to miss games. Coaches don't recognize warning signs. Players return too early after head injuries, suffer repeated impacts, and increase their risk of long term neurological problems. The difference between those two futures isn't talent, it isn't luck, it's education and prevention. I'll leave you with this. Sports will always involve risk. That's part of the competition. But unnecessary brain injuries don't have to be. By supporting mandatory concussion education and precision baseline cognitive testing, we can help protect young athletes while allowing them to continue playing the sports they love. Because at the end of the day, championships last a season, your brain has to last a lifetime. So, with that being said, I would like to take at least 2 minutes to answer questions on the presentation as a whole, or any questions you may have in general.
Who's going first?
You can.
Okay. Um, why isn't there like an industry that just like makes equipment concussion safe? You know, better gloves, better helmets, shoulder pads, reduce whiplash.
Okay, so there actually is products in place right now. Like, I don't know if you watched the NFL lately, but people wear these things called Guardian caps that have been in place for about 2 seasons. It's like a 1 inch thick piece of styrofoam that goes around the helmet. It looks kind of goofy. A lot of players are choosing not to wear it because it looks ridiculous and they don't want to, they'd rather have more risk than look cool on the football field, you know? There's also other reasons why it can't be implemented correctly because it might adjust the sport as a whole. Adding new gear might change the way your body functions in the game, the mobility you have. And that's why I think there's not more than there is and what they can do, people are opting out of, you know? Also, in instances like soccer where you have to head the ball, it's a part of the game. You have to do it. And if they wanted to go as extreme as to make heading the ball illegal, it would change the sport
Trash.
entirely. So people think about that every time they do it, but
Mace.
there's only so much you can do.
Trash.
That's why education is important.
Gotcha.
What
Go ahead.
what football position do you think is the most
Prone.
what football, yeah, to getting CTE?
I would say the linemen, because every play that they snap the ball, they're going head to head at the front of the line. That's what I've heard from NFL players, that the linemen get it the worst.
Mm.
Because every play they're going head to head with a defensive tackle or a big nose tackle, slamming helmets every play. And they're small, they're close, but it's repetition, right? And then I would say maybe someone like a fullback, maybe, or like a tight end. Because they're more brooding players, a linebacker, perhaps, because they use their body and especially their head and their upper half to impact the play. So I would say those would be secondary. Just
Okay.
because also the frequency at which they're being touched, right? A wide receiver might not get the ball all game and he doesn't get touched, but a linebacker is constantly jumping into the pile, trying to make a tackle, this, that, and the third. So that's my answer.
Nice. I don't have a question. Excellent presentation.
Good
Okay,
job.
fair enough. All right, I'm gonna stop the recording
Okay.
if I can.